writers, you're listening to the Kobo Writing Life podcast, where we bring you insights and inspiration for growing your self-publishing business. We're your hosts. I'm Rachel, Author Engagement Manager at Kobo Writing Life.
And I'm Tara, Director of Kobo Writing Life. This week on the podcast, we're talking to Deepa Anappara. Deepa was born in Kerala, southern India, and worked as a journalist for 11 years. Her reports on how poverty and religious violence impact the education of children won her several awards. Her debut novel, Gin Patrol on the Purple Line, was named as one of the best books of the year by the New York Times, the Washington Post, Time, and NPR, and has been translated into over 20 languages. And today we're talking to her about her latest book, The Last on Earth.
We had such an insightful and wonderful conversation with Deepa. She chatted with us about how her previous career in journalism impacted her writing and the challenges of going from nonfiction like journalism into the fiction realm and how she overcame those challenges. She chatted a lot about her upcoming novel, The Last of Earth. We talked about the inspiration behind it, the amount of research that went into it, and how she interwove the quiet character moments in this novel with this grand exploration plot. It was such an interesting conversation. And if you are looking to add more depth to your settings or to tackle historical fiction, there is so much wonderful advice in here, and we hope you enjoy. Okay, we are joined today by author Deepa Anappara. Deepa, thank you so much for taking the time and chatting with us today.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm so pleased to meet you online.
Very nice to meet you as well. And just to kind of kick things off, can you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I used to work as a journalist in India, where I was born. So I did that for several years before moving to the UK. And once I moved to the UK, I started writing fiction seriously. Even though I had wanted to write fiction from the time I was a child, it was only when I moved to this country that I tried to develop it further. I took a few courses in writing. So yeah, I switched from journalism, which is very objective, very fact-based, to fiction. And I've been writing now for several years. I also teach creative writing currently. So yeah, I think that's about me.
So you've always wanted to be a fiction writer, you mentioned. I guess I wonder, can you tell us a little bit about why you went into journalism and then your transition into fiction and the differences there, and I guess how you're more immersed now in the creative writing field?
Yeah, I think part of it is just that, many South Asians say the same thing, really, because their parents will tell them that, you have to become a doctor or an engineer. In my case, I could have become an accountant. I think they would have been happy with that. But looking at it, more objectively, it was that I grew up without a lot of privilege, and my parents were worried that if I, became a writer, especially a writer of fiction, then I was opening myself up to all sorts of financial risk. And so they wanted me to do something that would ensure that I had a salary at the end of the month. And for them, it was, I think I chose journalism because it gave me a chance to write, even though it wasn't the kind of writing that at least initially I wanted to do. I felt that at least, I will be writing every day. And that felt to me like a good compromise. And once I started, working in journalism, I trained as a journalist, and then I started working for newspapers in India. I really did enjoy the work, and I was mostly writing about subjects that really mattered to me and subjects that I felt needed to be raised in the mainstream discourse. So in many ways, it felt like, it was my way of contributing to society, because I was always an introvert. I didn't really like going up and speaking to people. Nobody will call me to speak at a rally because I don't think I'll be able to motivate anyone that way. But writing was essentially my safe place where I could best express myself. And I found that I could do that through journalism. So, I was reading quite a lot of books. I was thinking of writing fiction, but I wasn't really doing any of that during that time period when I worked as a journalist. And after I moved to the UK, because there were creative writing courses here, none of which were available in India at that time. But once I moved here, I realized that I could do a few evening courses in creative writing and really learn about the techniques and aspects of writing that I didn't know because I don't have an English degree. So, it really felt like I was gaining some formal grounding in the basic aspects of craft, which I didn't know at that time. And it was also quite difficult for me to switch from journalism to fiction because, I was working for daily newspapers. We were really taught to write about things, standing at an objective distance from the events that we were describing. And whereas fiction is really about being fully immersed in the mind of a character and seeing everything from their perspective and understanding the world as they would understand it. So it didn't come to me easily. And I think it took me, a long time to get that right. And of course, I teach creative writing, so it's very different. I only think about writing. Either I'm teaching a class on writing, or I'm thinking about my own writing, or I'm reading a student's work and giving them feedback. So that might be too much as well. I'm not sure. Maybe I need to go out and live in the real world a little bit. I don't know. But yeah, that's what my life is like now.
I'm curious about the transition from journalism to writing fiction. You mentioned there were some challenges of inhabiting your character's brain and no longer writing from an objective standpoint. But I'm curious about the other end and if there's anything from journalism that has helped your writing of fiction.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, one of the benefits of working in a newsroom that's very noisy and, you're writing to deadlines. So I think I'm able to write pretty much anywhere. I don't really need this quiet space. It's great if it's there. But once I've started a project, I'm pretty much able to write anywhere. I find deadlines helpful, I think, like most writers, because otherwise I'd probably procrastinate forever. But I think one of the biggest, pros of having been a journalist is that it really taught me how to research well. So particularly with The Last of Earth, because it's a historical novel, there was a fair amount of research involved. And I think, I had a proper process for doing that. And also because you gather so much information, and then you have to sift through that and see what are you actually going to use in the novel. And I think for me, that process was easier because it was something that I'd done as a journalist, in that, you interview a lot of people, you gather a lot of material, and then you have to sit and prune and see what will make for both an engaging story and, an effective way in which you can convey the message that you want the story to state. So I think, that background as a journalist really helped with the research, especially in this novel.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk about this book, The Last of Earth. And I'm wondering if you can give listeners a little bit of an overview, as it's quite a large topic and subject.
Yeah.
But yeah, tell us what this book is about.
I think I was just thinking this morning that by the time I've explained what it's about, people may have gone away. So I'm going to try and keep it short, but I may not be successful. Only because, it is, as you say, quite a layered subject. So The Last of Earth is a historical novel. It's set in mid-19th century Tibet, when it was known as the Forbidden Kingdom because it was closed to Westerners. But Indians could go in for trade and pilgrimage. And the British, who were ruling India at that time, they were interested in Tibet. They saw it as a region that could be important to them politically. But because they couldn't enter Tibet themselves, they trained Indians in very basic aspects of cartography, and they sent them to Tibet, where they would gather information, often using their own bodies as surveying instruments, and they would gather geographical details that they would bring back to the British, who would then use that information to create maps. So this is a real story, and my novel is based on these real stories of Indians who traveled to Tibet to conduct surveys for the British. And it tells the story of two characters. One is an Indian spy surveyor named Balram, who is taking a misguided English explorer into Tibet. And then you have the perspective of a female explorer named Catherine, who wants to be the first European woman to reach Lhasa, which is the capital of the Tibet kingdom. So it's a story of these two perspectives, and it's a novel about exploration and cartography.
I think you nailed it. You nailed it.
Thank you. Thank you.
So it's a really sweeping book that delves into the moral ambiguity of empire and complicity. So I'm just curious about the inspiration behind this. What inspired you to tackle this specific time period and like this part of the world?
Yeah, so I think from the time I was a child, I was interested in Tibet. I think in many ways I was obsessed with the region. And, partly that's because a number of Tibetans, when they fled China, they came to India along with the Dalai Lama. So those are stories that, most Indians would have grown up on. So it was the same for me. I've always wanted to visit Tibet as well. But I think it was only when I moved to the UK that I became more aware of it's hard to describe, but when you're in India, you don't really think about colonialism and what is the after effect of colonialism, because you're dealing with your day-to-day problems and you have like corrupt governments and politicians like everywhere else. So that becomes kind of the focus of your life. But when I moved to the UK, I became really aware that British colonialism is not something that is discussed in this country, not in the way that slavery is taught, and, what are the effects of enslaving people. It's something that's discussed in the American curriculum, or at least it was discussed. But there's not much discussion here at all. And I would have people coming up to me and saying, the empire was a civilizing mission, or that, we gave you the railways, so what's there to complain about? And I just found, those remarks not only rooted in ignorance, but also from that failure to really engage with that question of what colonialism does, not only to countries and not only to a country's economy, but also to the sense of identity that a person may have. In many ways, the feelings of superiority that we see, for instance, in the far-right movements in Britain, it stems from that idea that the British are an exceptional people. It's a very small island, and they were controlling most of the world at one time. And I felt that there had to be a discussion, some form of corrective, that this is not something that you should be proud of. And I think when I found this book in a secondhand bookshop where I was browsing, I was in London, and this particular book was an explorer's account of traveling to Tibet with two of his Indian servants. And it was very clear when I was reading this book that he could not have survived in Tibet without the two Indians. But, he was the explorer, it was his account, and the Indians were just kind of figures in the backdrop. And I thought this is a relationship that I felt I wanted to explore in a novel, and, fiction seemed like the right place to explore that dynamic where, typically the colonizer has almost all the power. But if you're in a place like Tibet, where you're cut off from everything and everybody else, you're very reliant on these people you call your servants. So I was interested in exploring that dynamic between these characters. And this is also a story which is, you see glimpses of the story in Rudyard Kipling's Kim, which, the Indian curriculum and books in India, there's a lot of influence from Britain. So we read a lot of Kipling and had seen that story in Kim. So the book started as an attempt to retell the story of Kim through an Indian lens. But I think at some point I just threw away what I'd written and I started all over again with Balram and Catherine's characters.
I want to stay on the characters for a second, because as a reader, I found it really interesting to follow Catherine and Balram, because it was really hard to know whether or not you wanted to cheer for them to succeed. Because I feel like as readers, we're almost trained to cheer for our protagonists, to cheer for the point of view. But in this book, they are also operating as like agents of colonization. So there was this like moral ambiguity as a reader of, okay, do I want these two characters to succeed in their mission or not? So I'm like really curious how you tackled that complexity when writing these points of view.
As a writer, I think I really try to stay close to my characters' perspectives. So it's one thing that I learned once I left journalism, it was really to stay rooted in the character's mind and see the world as they see it. And I felt that it was important for me to show them in, all their complexity, because when I did all my research, I couldn't find anything about, say, the Indian point of view in the historical record, because the historical record was written by the British. And those records were very carefully curated. So if there was anything that made the British look bad, they would take it out. And in fact, they're still taking it out to this day. you will read stories saying that, British actions in Kenya, those stories have been erased. So it was really, for me, I had to really locate the Indian consciousness in both my story and in the historical record. And I felt a sense of responsibility that I think, I might not have felt if it was set in any other time period or if it had any other anyone else's characters. So I was really thinking, what does it do to one's sense of identity to be, beholden to someone who's colonized you and who doesn't see you as an equal? And I think for me, following Balram and staying really close to his emotions, that was a way in which, I felt that I could illustrate some of those experiences. In the case of Catherine, she's really based on many of the female explorers who traveled quite a lot in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And they also wrote books. So there was some more information for me to create Catherine's character than there was for Balram. And I think it was interesting for me that for many of these women, they were facing, several restrictions and constraints in their societies back home because women didn't have a lot of freedoms. But at the same time, it didn't naturally make them look at, say, the native as they write about Indians. They didn't see them any differently. So it was still a very patronizing and condescending view. And in the case of Catherine, because she's mixed race, I think there's some more complexity to how she views other Indians. And I felt that, that was something that I could use in the novel as well. So it's really, I want to say I really thought about all this quite a lot, but I would say it was a much more, it just came organically, I would say, in trying to just think about how will these characters feel at that particular moment. So it was just trying to understand that.
Well, the layers within the characters was so fascinating to read and uncover, especially because, like, as much as this is a novel about exploration, it's also a novel about grief and ambition. And I really enjoyed how the protagonists are, for lack of a better word, like haunted by those that they have lost. And I'm curious how you balance the journey and exploration aspect of the novel with these quieter character moments.
Because they're spending so much time just walking, and even though they are in groups, there are other people around them. It's traveling through Tibet it's not really conducive to conversation, I would say, because it's such a high altitude. So mostly you're walking by yourself. You have a lot of time to think, and there is something about the landscape of Tibet in particular that I think influences your, not only your emotions, but also how you approach life and how you feel about life quite differently. In that, Tibetans invest their landscapes with a lot of sacredness. They call their mountains mothers and they call their lakes fathers. So it's almost like they're meant to be guardians. So that relationship with the landscape is quite different. So you're calling yourself an explorer, but that's not how Tibetans look at the landscape. For them, it's not something to discover or conquer, but it's something that's part of your life, part of your family. And I felt that would have, that way in which you look at the world. And because Tibet is, most Tibetans, at least today, are Buddhists. And so there's Buddhist philosophy that permeates that particular world, and it's very much focused on notions of impermanence and notions of not having an ego, being able to see yourself as a speck in the universe. And I felt that all that will have an influence on the characters as well. It's, even if you're thinking, I have a mission and I have to get to this point by the end of today, there's no way you can escape the influence of both the landscape and the Buddhist philosophy that region is steeped in. So I felt that as long as they were not dealing with immediate dangers, there would be some time for them to think about that, think about what's going on in their lives and trying to make peace with what's happened. I think even today, many of us will walk or trek or climb because it's the time to, untangle many of the thoughts in our heads. And I felt that this expedition, for instance, would allow them to do something quite similar.
Yeah, I think Tibet itself almost serves as like a third protagonist in your book, and it's a really compelling and visual landscape. So one, I want to know if did you go to Tibet as part of your research? And then also just if you have any advice for authors that want to create such a kind of compelling landscape within the page.
Mm-hmm. I actually couldn't travel to Tibet as I was writing the first draft because it was during the pandemic and China had closed Tibet. So it really looked like I would not be able to go there at all. I think the benefit is that Tibet is quite, the landscape is quite similar to the landscape in parts of India, which were once considered Little Tibet, so there's a region in India called Ladakh, and it would have been once part of Tibet. So I had been to that region. And then I had read a lot of explorers' accounts. So when I was writing the first draft, I relied mostly on that. And it was only once I had a draft that I could travel to Tibet. And obviously I edited a lot once I had visited the region. I think what was particularly instructive was looking at how, the high altitudes, it alters your mind and your capability to think, and also group travel as well, because you cannot travel through Tibet by yourself. So you can't take a backpack and go around Tibet because travel around the region is very tightly controlled. And you have to go as part of a tour, and you don't really have a say on who else is going to be in the tour with you. So that was also instructive for me for thinking about that experience, particularly for Balram, and who has a bigger group of porters traveling along with him and the captain. So I think traveling there was actually really helpful, but I wrote most of the book, at least the first draft, before I had traveled there. So I would say research is really important, and looking for some of the minor details that people may include in their accounts and about the weather that may actually become quite significant for the characters, in the novel. So in terms of writing advice, did you mean advice in terms of capturing the physicality of a location?
Yeah, exactly.
I think, visiting the places, of course, I think essential. But if that's not possible for a while, I think looking at accounts, looking at pictures and videos, because there's so much of that's really important. But then, the writer Tiffany Yannick wrote a piece called On Characterization in the book Letters to a Writer of Color that I had co-edited. And something that she says there is that as writers, we don't think about the influence of space on characterization. And by that, she means, as she explains, if you're born in the mountains, your character will be very different to that of a person who has grown up in the plains or in the desert, because, setting has that influence on your character, which is not something we often think about. But I think that is a useful tip, I find, to not only get the details, the physical details right, but to think about how is that affecting the emotionality of the character, and also their responses to certain situations may depend on whether they were born in an isolated area or whether they were raised as part of a community where people are used to talking to each other or helping each other out. So I think those are other questions to consider in relation to space as well.
I love that. I don't know if I've ever considered the character creation aspect when taking into account like what you're used to growing up in the environment around you. I love that. And we've touched on research a couple of times here, and I'm really curious how the research plus writing process went, because you mentioned your journalism background helped you parse through the research, but I'm curious just kind of how you constructed the novel. Was it research first, then draft, then more research, then editing? How did all of this come together?
Yeah, I think I pretty much believe in researching, before writing, during writing, and even after writing. I think I would have continued researching it. I really feel like I still don't know everything that I could have known about that time. And really, you can read about the mid-19th century, and I could read about it my entire lifetime, and it will still not be enough. So I think at some point you do have to forcefully press pause or stop. It's similar to writing a book. I could edit it. Like I have finished copies are out now. If I open a page, I can probably edit almost all the sentences in every single page. So it's not something that ever stops, but it's a question of, making yourself step away from the draft, I think. So it was quite similar. The process of research was quite similar for me. I had to know certain things before writing the novel. I always mention what, Hilary Mantel said in her BBC Wraith lectures. She says that she gave herself permission to imagine a man's inner torments, but she had to get the color of the wallpaper right. So the wallpaper is a specific historic detail that she could not, create from her imagination. But what a man was thinking, that she gave herself permission to recreate from her imagination. So I think I followed something quite similar, in that I felt there were certain things that I do need to know about this time, like what do they carry with them on an expedition, what would they have been wearing, what would they have been eating. I couldn't write the novel without those basic details. What's the route map that they would have followed. So, and that was actually, finding that was the most difficult part of research, because many of those places don't exist anymore and they have been renamed, so you can't find them on Google Maps. And, I had to find a book with 19th century maps of Tibet to actually figure out what the route is that they would have taken. So I think those things I really needed to know, but some of the other things I just gave myself permission to not know. So I would put, for instance, I didn't know if they had glass at all in that time for a long time. So I would just put glass bottle and leave a note to myself that this is something that I had to check later. But I felt that wouldn't significantly change the story. But, those concrete details about the expedition, that could change the story. So I had to know those facts first.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the insights into how they're charting the land, even counting the steps and little things like that, because I think we forget, right? We're just forever have seen these maps and you're like, how do people actually even create some of this stuff? So the research came through in those pieces for sure.
Yeah, thank you but this was an especially basic way of map making. So, when the British were mapping India, they still had some more geographical instruments and they had a particular way in which they were mapping the country. But they couldn't carry those instruments, which were quite heavy, into Tibet because they would have been found out. So what they taught these people to do was to walk so that they could cover a mile in exactly 2,000 paces. So, they were counting every 2,000 paces and saying, okay, this is a mile from here, from the river to this mountain, it's a mile. So that's how they calculated most of the routes around Tibet. And the astonishing thing is that since then, it's been proved that they were mostly right. These Indian surveyors who walked and calculated the routes using their paces and their bodies, the routes actually matched what was discovered subsequently.
That's wild. And also to have the concentration to be able to count without losing your place is something I could not do.
Yeah, me neither. It's just, and also this is, I think, one of the reasons why I wanted to write the book, because I kept thinking, why would you do that? There should have been other ways of making a livelihood, because this is almost impossible. And, it was also such a dangerous terrain that, these Indians were opening themselves up to all sorts of dangers. They were attacked. In some of the reports, you can see that they were attacked by robbers in Tibet. And despite that, they would go back and then do this again, so that they actually had the numbers and the figures for the miles. So it was that kind of dedication that for the life of me, I couldn't understand. And I was trying to figure that out through this novel. What makes you so loyal and beholden to someone who doesn't see you as an equal?
I have a kind of silly question. If you had the luxury of technology and modern equipment, would you make the trek that your characters attempted today?
I mean, I did go to Tibet. I did try to, go to these regions, at least most of the regions that they visited. And I will say that even today it is quite tough. Some of the treks are through, mountains that go up to 18,000 feet. And it's not something, I don't trek otherwise. But I did that for the sake of the book. because I felt that I had to really experience what my characters went through. But if you ask me, is this something that I'll do for fun? It's not. I will not. This is not my idea of fun. I love the natural world. I loved being in Tibet, but I don't have to be at 18,000 feet ever again.
The roof of the world for a reason, right? But I can't even imagine it. I would love to maybe one day, but I love that you got to go there as part of it.
Do you trek?
No, I did. I was on vacation in Chile recently, and I went to the Atacama Desert, which was like 4,000 meters, and not near the 18,000, but that was really interesting. But I'm really interested in like the drive. That's why I loved your novel so much. Is I read a lot about Everest. I have no intention of ever doing that or going there, but why do people have this like call to it? Like I find that so fascinating, and just reading about like what the body can do, or like how like the survival that goes on in like those areas. I find it so fascinating, and especially with like the, I guess like the, I don't want to say unsung, but underappreciated like local Nepal people that like are just going about their life. They're like, we just live here, you know? I find it really interesting.
I mean, when I wrote the book, I was definitely, or at least when I was thinking about the book, there was all this conflict between Sherpas and the Western tourists on Everest. So definitely that did influence the book. I mean, I watched all sorts of, pretty much all the documentaries that are there about expeditions to Tibet, but also up Everest. And I think it is really interesting, when you're in Tibet, you can see there is an Everest base camp in Tibet, because you can see the northern face of Everest from there. You can also climb Everest from Tibet, but most people don't do that because it's very hard to get permits. But, there's like a monument there which says, Everest 8,880 meters or whatever. I don't remember the exact altitude. And there was all these Chinese tourists, especially young men, because, we were already at an altitude which is close to 4,500 meters, I think. So breathing is pretty hard. And so they were doing, push-ups. And they were taking videos, TikTok videos about these men doing push-ups at that altitude. And I just thought, this is, I don't know what it is in us that makes us want to show off that, I climbed this mountain, or like I can do push-ups at 5,000 meters and, I'm still fine. Even though they would just, as soon as they finished, they would be, they would have an oxygen cap stuck to their noses. But for that brief period for the TikTok, it was like, I'm so cool, I can do a push-up at 5,000 meters. And I think that impulse is something that drives a lot of people who are outsiders to travel to that region. And really, when you look at the Tibetan relationship with their landscape and with the mountains, it's so different, I was feeling pretty proud that I had climbed 18,000 feet. And then, the man who was driving me to the airport said he had done that 53 times because he had taken tourists up there 53 times. So they don't see it as exploration, For them, it's more like a pilgrimage. It's more like, you're linking your soul to that of the mountain. So it's very different. And I think it's something that I wanted to examine in this book as well.
You talked about kind of the female climbers there as well, or the documentaries, and the Lakpa Sherpa one is really great. The Mountain Queen, it's on Netflix for people to check out. She was like the first Nepalese woman to climb. I mean, I think she climbed it like 10 times, but breaking barriers in like being a female Sherpa that's climbing Everest. And your book really touches on like other societal challenges that women face. And you talked about this a little bit earlier, but just wondering if you can chat about like how you approached crafting such compelling female characters who are facing these historical or societal issues.
What was really helpful for me, were the accounts by female explorers. So I'm sure they were not being entirely truthful in what they wrote in those accounts and, the view that they presented to the world. But it was still fascinating for me that they didn't seem to be afraid. Some of them were actually bedridden when they were at home in London, but then they would go, say, to India, to Ladakh, which, as I said, was once considered part of Tibet, and they were riding horses over high altitudes. So it seemed like, when they were out in the world, away from the eyes of society, they seemed to be more capable of, doing things that they couldn't when they were back at home. And I thought that was an interesting juxtaposition also to explore, in that they could be more, the kind of people that they actually wanted to be when they were in these remote areas, where there wasn't the chance that someone would see them, say, talking to a man, and take that story or rumor back home, because that was something many of them worried about as well. So I think the female explorers' accounts, that was really useful as a scaffolding to build Catherine's character. I also read quite a number of studies and interviews, with people who were called Eurasians, that's people who are mixed race. At one time, it was very common for English officers to marry Indian women and have children with them, and that was not frowned upon. But by the time it was the mid-19th century, it was seen as something that couldn't be done. And those who were mixed race were, they were not seen as being in the same class as white English people. So I thought that was, again, something interesting to look at. The fact that in many ways, maybe you were raised in an English house and you feel more English, but you're not quite seen as English either because your skin is more brown, or because, you have a mother who is an Indian. I felt that this was a story that was, again, not looked into as much. When I was reading about a female explorer, and this was a biography, and there was a paragraph in that biography where it spoke of her heritage and how she was, you could trace her heritage to different continents. But that was something that was never actually discussed. She doesn't talk about that in her writing. And I wanted to show, through Catherine's point of view, how she would present herself to the world, which we see in these very brief journal entries which are there in the novel, and how she actually experiences those moments, and the kind of questions that she may have about her own identity. So I think it was really, I relied on research to write her character, I would say.
I just want to touch on Catherine's journals for a really quick second, because I thought it was such an interesting way to show how Catherine is portraying herself to the world. And I'm curious if that was something that was included in the book from the beginning, or if it was something that was added to give that extra layer of this is how Catherine wants people to see her journey versus this is what is happening.
No, it was there in the book from the very beginning. I think as soon as I finished, I would say I wrote Catherine's chapter first, but as soon as I finished that first chapter, which is the second chapter in the novel, I knew that I wanted to include a journal, because I could already see how she was constructing a story about what was happening. And I thought that it was important to make that process visible, because this book is also about, what has been erased from the historical record. And in Catherine's journal, I think, is, it's the only material object in the book, I would say, that actually shows you the difference between what someone is actually experiencing and how they're portraying that experience, and, that difference that's there between those two modes. And I felt that I had to really make that visible on the page. And so her journal was one way of doing that. Some of the journals were longer, and, I made it shorter in the editing process based on feedback from my editors. But it was there from the beginning.
I want to talk about your first book for a second, Gin Patrol on the Purple Line, which was incredibly successful. And I'm curious about how that experience influenced or changed your approach to writing, or did it make it harder to write the second book in terms of, managing expectations or creative freedoms, or did you feel any pressure with your second novel?
The only way it really changed this book was that, as I said, I wanted it to be a retelling of Kipling's Kim. And Kipling's Kim is a young man. I can't remember his age now, but he's a young boy. And so I wrote around 30,000 words from the perspective of a young boy who was Indian, kind of using the same techniques to tell the same story, but in a different way. And after I'd written 30,000 words was when I finished edits on Gin Patrol. And by the time, the edits with the editors, And by the time I was done with the edits, I just thought I cannot write another boy. I cannot write another, young person's voice. I'm just so over it, at least for now. So those 30,000 words that I threw away were written in this young person's narration. I really wanted to do something which was completely different from Gin Patrol. And I knew that this was the story I wanted to write, very much set in the 19th century when the sensibility is completely different. Faith has such an important role in anyone's life at that time, especially in the Indian subcontinent, which is very different from how it is maybe today in Western societies. So I wanted to, I knew that I had to look at this book completely differently from how I'd approached Gin Patrol. What was helpful for me was that I wrote the book during most of the first draft during the pandemic when we couldn't even go out. So I was reading a lot of 19th century literature. I was really living in that time in many ways. So essentially what I wanted to do was to write this 19th century adventure novel using many of its tropes, but then subverting those expectations. But I think what it allowed me to do was, I was completely separated from everything that was going on. When a book comes out, typically you go out, you meet readers, you have events if you're lucky. In my case, pretty much, everything that I did was from this room. So I was not meeting anyone. So it was easier for me really to separate myself from, anything around my first book. And I think it also played into some of those Buddhist ideas or philosophies of impermanence and how you view life. In the book, there is this mention of these pictures that are made out of sand called mandalas. So these are drawings, that monks make using colored sand. And so they draw these figures on the ground. It takes them 2 or 3 weeks. And once it's finished, they just brush it away. So they've spent all that effort into creating something, and then they're just destroying it to prove to themselves and to remind themselves that everything is impermanent. So in that sense, I think I tried to adopt as much of Buddhist philosophy as I could as I was writing this novel. I was reading a lot of Buddhist philosophy for research anyway. So I tried to implement some of that in my life. I can't say it was fully successful, but at least when I was writing the first draft, I think I tried to follow some of those, ideas.
That's so interesting because the young POV on Gin Patrol is something that really stood out, where you're like writing from these like children's perspective, but it's not a YA or a book for children, So I can totally understand why you'd want to go in the opposite direction. But that's super interesting just to learn the decision making that's gone into like your second book there.
Yeah, I really wanted this to be in some ways a different book, but I think in terms of themes, I think I'm interested in the same questions. So for me, my writing is almost always about either resurrecting or recreating voices that have been marginalized, whether that's historically or, in contemporary society, just because of the inequalities in our society. So I'm interested in bringing out those voices that are not typically heard. And, Gin Patrol was about children in an impoverished area who were being kidnapped or who were vanishing. And with this novel, it's about these voices of Indians and of women explorers that are not typically included in the archives. So excavating these voices, which are in many ways marginalized, I think, you can see both these books have that thematic unity in them.
I'm curious because you now have 2 novels under your belt. You are teaching creative writing and you had a previous career as a journalist. So at this point in your writing career, I'm curious what part of the process from initial ideation to research to final manuscript do you now find the most challenging, and what strategies throughout your career have you developed to overcome those hurdles?
I would say the most difficult part for me is still convincing myself that I should be using my time to write. I don't know how much of that is, because of the fact that I'm a woman or a South Asian woman. I grew up in a very patriarchal society that didn't see a lot of value in women as a whole. So there are these questions around still seeing my writing as something that is worth my time in some ways, in that, when you're writing a book, you don't know if it will sell, you don't know if your editor is going to like it or whether it will go anywhere. So it's not like any other work which is kind of somebody else will take a look at it and give you some feedback. It might be published. If you're a journalist, your work might see the light of day the next day. Whereas with a book, it's several, at least for me, it's several years of writing without really knowing, is this going anywhere? There is an article by Catherine Chetkovich called Envy, a personal essay. I don't know if you've read that. I think you can find a copy in The Guardian or Granta online, where she talks about living with a very successful male writer and how when she sat in front of her laptop, she would instead turn to her copy editing or other jobs because she felt that was more valuable. Somebody's going to pay her for that rather than her own writing. And I think for me, it's so strange that it's still, I would still say that is my biggest problem is, shutting down all these voices in my head that tell me that I shouldn't be writing or I should be doing something like, I don't know, gardening or weeding, anything else. You can see the result almost immediately that it's a better thing to do than actually writing, which may not go anywhere. So, and I also think we are living in this society that kind of, it rewards if you're posting something on Instagram, you're saying something, there will be almost an immediate response. And you don't get that with writing a book. So, yeah, it is. I think for me, the biggest challenge, I would say, is silencing all these voices in my head to this day. I think the good thing is that if I don't write for a long period of time, I feel like something is missing, and sometimes I think about the fact that this particular story is something that only I can tell, not because, I'm a supremely capable writer, but because of the particular set of experiences that I've had, just as any person's life is unique. There are aspects of my life that nobody else could write about, or, things that I think about that maybe nobody else is interested in. And it's a way in which I can tell that story and try and see if I can make that engaging for others as well. I think that's what keeps me going. So I think I enjoy writing. I enjoy writing the first draft, discovering things at the same time as my characters. I don't typically start out with a plan. I like revising and editing. At that point, I have spreadsheets and it's much more well planned. So I think those aspects of writing, I don't really mind. But what I really struggle with, I think, is this kind of almost daily mental battle that I have to do to convince myself that it is okay to write.
Well, the dreaded question of are you writing something right now? I know you're just releasing this book. I always feel terrible asking this, but are you overcoming that battle? Just curious if you're working on something for the next book.
Yeah, I do have an idea for a next novel.
Okay,
it's just
great.
it's slow going. Yeah, but it's there. I'm writing a little bit.
Nice. That must be, you get to sort of like take a little bit of a break and before you can dive into your next one.
Yeah.
It's been really lovely talking with you today. And if listeners are curious to kind of find you online, where can they find you and check out your book?
I have a website. So if you Google my name, my website should come up pretty much, in one of the earliest pages. I am on Instagram. It's my first name dot last name. That's Deepa.Anappara on Instagram. Yeah, so you can send me a message either on Instagram or my website is a contact page where you can leave a message for me as well.
Great. Thanks so much for chatting with us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Kobo Writing Life podcast. If you're interested in Deepa's books, we will include links in our show notes. If you've been enjoying this podcast, please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe. And if you are looking for more tips on growing your self-publishing business, you can find us on social. We are at Kobo Writing Life on Facebook, Blue Sky, Instagram, and Threads.
This episode was hosted by Tara Kremen and Rachel Warden, with production by Terrence Abrahams. Editing is provided by Kelly Robotham. Our theme music is composed by Tearjerker, and a huge thanks to Deepa for being our guest. If you're ready to start your publishing journey, sign up today at kobo.com/writinglife. Until next time, happy writing.